Hey everyone, Sam Pearson here, back for another video. Today we're going to do a deep dive into a game I led the design for whilst I worked in the Warhammer design studio at Games Workshop as a rules writer, and that game is Warcry. So if you're new to the channel, we've done a video looking at another game that I led the design for, and that's Spearhead for Age of Sigmar. But this channel is more broadly about tabletop games design. So we've done a video where we explored the classic game Inquisitor, and we looked at the history of narrative skirmish war games, and we've done a games design theory video too, where we looked at activation systems in war games. So I go, you go, alternate activation, and everything in between. So if any of those videos sound interesting to you, make sure you check them out after this one. Today's topic is one that is very, very, very dear to my heart, and that's Warcry. I was the lead designer of Warcry for the entirety of the first edition. I also led the design of the second edition of Warcry, so I did the core rules and I also did the starter set, and then I passed over the baton to another team. But off the bat, it might be interesting to say that while Warcry is a design that I'm very, very proud of, that wasn't always the case. Also, another interesting thing to say at the start is while I am credited as the lead rules writer, and for first edition that is 100% true, I wrote every single sentence in every rules section of every book, many of its most famous and iconic mechanics were actually designed by another designer, someone who you all know the name of. So those two things are going to be interesting to unpack. Let's talk about Warcry. I'll see you after the jump. In this video, I'm not going to dwell too long on the ins and outs of how Warcry works, but let me give you a 2-minute introduction. Warcry was first released in 2019 and was Age of Sigmar's first fully fledged skirmish game. By that I mean it is a war game where each player controls a warband of around 10 fighters who all operate individually on the battlefield. And following on from a long-standing tradition of Warhammer skirmish games starting with Necromunda and Mordheim, Warcry had a strong emphasis on narrative play and campaigns. For those unfamiliar, a campaign is a system for players to link their battles together into an ongoing story. There have been 2 editions of Warcry so far, and each edition has been set in a specific location across the mortal realms. For the first edition, that setting was the 8 Points, or more specifically one slice of the 8 Points pizza called the Bloodwind Spoil. Here is a desolate landscape under the domain of Archaon, the ruler of the mortal warriors who follow the dark gods of chaos. And here rival warbands fight amidst the ruins, hoping to amass glory and one day join Archaon's legions. The gameplay is fast and brutal. Battles are fought on a small battlefield packed with terrain, where the particulars of the scenario are determined randomly by drawing 4 cards: the terrain, the deployment, the objective, and the twist. This means that every battle is a random draw, and a unique combination from among the tens of thousands possible. The game is also well known for its unique initiative system. Every round, each player rolls 6 dice. Whoever rolls the most singles, that is the dice without a matching pair, gets to choose who activates a fighter first, whereas matching dice are sorted into 2 of a kind, 3 of a kind, and 4 of a kind, or doubles, triples, and quads. And these are used to unleash powerful abilities unique to every warband. As the battle progresses, you gain a pool of wild dice too, which spice up this system even further by allowing players to choose any result for them, granting an extra single or turning a double into a triple, and so on. The gameplay is very dynamic. It is alternate activation, so play goes back and forth between the players, and I think it was the first game from the mainline studio to be true alternate activation. The game also gives players a lot of freedom. Fighters can scale walls and jump across gaps as far as their movement can take them, with no dice rolls or reduced speed. This means it is a game of scrambling up walls before leaping off platforms to deal a death blow to an unsuspecting fighter below. So working on a project like Warcry was really a dream project for me. I grew up playing games like Necromunda and Mordheim, and for me, Necromunda in particular, I consider it my favourite Warhammer game of all time. Furthermore, in the run-up to me landing a job at Games Workshop, I developed a set of fan rules called Hinterlands for Age of Sigmar's first edition, which was my attempt at taking the 4-page rules philosophy of the first edition of Age of Sigmar and creating a narrative skirmish game based upon them. So narrative skirmish gaming really runs in my blood, which is why this was such a dream project for me. Now, one thing the Warhammer design studio is very good at is if a designer in the studio is particularly passionate about one thing, be it skirmish games or be it matched play or be it anything else, they will try their best to accommodate that designer. And so when they're planning out the work schedule ahead of time, they will try and fit projects with the designer that suits it best. At the same time, when I started working on Warcry, I was still very, very new inside the studio. I'd only been working there for maybe 6 months or so. So while I got to design the rules from the core book onwards for first edition, there was actually a whole chunk of design work that happened before that. And that's something we call R&D, or research and development. R&D is something done for all games and editions, and the goal is to put together a prototype and then present it to the studio management to get sign-off on it. R&D has to be one of the most enjoyable things to do in the studio, as you get to try out all sorts of ideas. For example, I did the R&D for Spearhead, so I created a prototype, and in that prototype it had things like the board with the objectives printed on them, the cards that could either score you victory points or be used as command abilities, the twist cards to help out the underdog, and all of that. Another exciting bit of R&D I got to do was 3rd edition Age of Sigmar. There were lots of prototypes put together for that edition, and one of those included something called monster dice. And what monster dice were was whenever a monster was fighting a unit that wasn't a monster, all of its dice got upgraded from D6s to D12s. So you would keep the hit, the wound characteristic and so on, but instead of rolling a 3+ on a D6, you'd be rolling a 3+ on a D12. That was one of the prototypes that didn't make it into the final edition. But for Warcry, it was not me who did the R&D. It was the one and only Jervis Johnson. So while I am credited as the lead rules writer for Warcry, as we're about to find out, a lot of its DNA should be credited to Jervis instead. So I thought this video would be an excellent chance to set the record straight and give Jervis his due credit. So there was a period of R&D that Jervis Johnson did the design work on, but to begin with, let's go even further back and talk about the initial starting point of Warcry. So the main Warhammer design studio is actually made up of 2 separate studios. There is the miniatures design studio, and there is the other studio which the rules writers and the background writers, artists, photographers and so on are part of, and that is called Book and Box Games. The initial starting point of different games will come from one of these 2 different studios. Sometimes games come from the rules writers first, or Book and Box Games. Kill Team was an example of this. Of course, you have Kill Team's roots in 4th edition 40k as a game mode, but even the 2018 relaunch was a game that came from Book and Box Games first, i.e. the product developers and the rules writers. Other games come from the miniatures design studio first instead, and Warcry was an example of this. The studio wanted to explore the mortal realms of Age of Sigmar in miniature form in more detail than ever before, and so they put together concepts for Chaos Warbands, where each warband came from a different one of the mortal realms. So you have the Iron Golem from the realm of metal, and the Untamed Beasts from the realm of beasts, the Scions of the Flame from the realm of fire, and even warbands from realms you would consider the least touched by chaos, for example the Cypher Lords from the realm of light. I love the design of these warbands still, and I think this is actually the best realization of the different realms turned into miniature concepts that we have had to date. So the miniatures design studio came up with the different look and feel for these warbands, and they imagined a game for them of gladiatorial combat, which I think you can see in the look of the miniatures. Many of them are wielding gladiatorial weapons, and that's probably why none of them have shoes. So that was the initial scope of the game, a gladiatorial game where each warband hailed from a different one of the mortal realms. But by the time the R&D had started, the scope of the game had already been expanded. With the mega success of Kill Team's relaunch in 2018, it was decided that the scope of the game should encompass all of the Age of Sigmar factions, and that it should act as a gateway into the bigger Age of Sigmar game too. A decision like that is made by the management team and the product developers, not by the rules writers. So I see lots of speculation on if that was a last-minute decision or not, but that's not the case. The other factions, things like the Stormcast Eternals, from very, very early on in the game's inception, it was decided that all of the Age of Sigmar factions would be part of the game. It was decided before any of the rules work had begun. But I do sympathise with some players who wished for a game that was focused on the Chaos warbands only. Not that I think it was the wrong decision to include the other warbands, but I can see the allure of a more focused game, and it's an interesting what if. What if the game had stayed focused just on the Chaos Warbands and maybe focused on gladiatorial combat as well? These gladiatorial roots were something I gave nod to when I painted my own set of Iron Golem. I ditched the reds and blacks more commonly seen on Chaos Warriors and went with a Greco-Roman inspired scheme with bronzed flesh and sandy bases to boot. Okay, so that's talking about the initial concept of Warcry and what the scope of the game was by the time the R&D began work on it. But now let's talk about Jervis Johnson's prototype for the game. What did that look like? Well, it had many of the hallmarks of the final game, and it was also a bit of a Frankenstein's monster of many other concepts and ideas that the studio had developed around the time. It had the small footprint battlefield, which was a concept that first appeared in Kill Team 2018. It had the battle plan cards determining the scenario, which first appeared as the legendary open war cards for 8th edition 40k. It had alternate activations, and most importantly, it had the unique initiative system where you roll 6 dice and look for both singles and matching dice. As I've said before, this is one of Warcry's most defining characteristics, and actually it's all the work of Jervis Johnson. He was always so good at coming up with these really fun dice mechanics like this. It's loved because it adds this emergent element to Warcry. You never know which abilities you're going to be able to do each round, so you cannot rely on them too much. In addition, it has some soft rubber banding, because the player with the most singles will have the fewer combos they can do, but they get to act first, which can be clutch in certain situations. So those were the elements of the prototype that made the final cut, but there were also lots and lots of elements inside the prototype that didn't make the final cut, and one of those was the dice that the game used. In the prototype, the game used the Blackstone Fortress dice, so the D6, the D8s and the D12s with the special symbols upon them. My memory is a little bit hazy now, but from what I remember, all fighters had a weapon skill characteristic, and you compared weapon skill when attacking. The fighter making the attack either got a D6, a D8 or a D12, depending on if the attacker's weapon skill was higher or lower than the target. And in each case, these weren't regular dice being rolled, but the special Blackstone Fortress dice that either had a miss, hit or critical on each face. Now this was a really cool system. We didn't cut it because it wasn't cool and it wasn't fun, but to keep costs down we needed to have a system that ran on standard D6s instead. And so that's where I came in to develop the system that was used in the final game. So the regular D6, the strength versus toughness, and then scoring either a miss, a hit, or a critical hit. So as you can see, so many of the defining characteristics of Warcry actually came from its prototype that was designed by Jervis Johnson. So what was my influence on the project? Well, it's more subtle in many ways, or it's in the details. First and foremost, I took Jervis's prototype and I turned it into a fully fledged game. I wrote every rule in every book for 1st edition, and there were a lot of books in 1st edition. I designed the playstyles for all of the factions. I wrote their stats and abilities, and under the brief put together by the product developer, I penned loads and loads of supplements. There were tons of books in 1st edition Warcry, and they covered all sorts of things, including taking on monsters in epic boss battles, fighting in dungeons, playing through choose your own adventure style branching campaigns, and even getting some solo and co-op play in there too. This was a massive undertaking, and I'm proud of that alone. Another aspect which is my stamp upon the game was something I called its parkour feel. I broke a lot of the conventions Warhammer skirmish games had around climbing and jumping by allowing fighters to scale walls at full speed and jump their full move distance. If you've ever played Warcry, you'll know it's full of characters scrambling up buildings as fast as they can before leaping off spires to attack enemies down below. The thing I am actually most proud of, however, in Warcry is its rules language. You see, every tabletop game, be it a war game, a board game, a card game, or a tabletop role-playing game, has its own unique rules language, and these operate kind of like a computer code. And when you're designing mechanics for that game, you need to write them within the boundaries of that rules language. For a lot of games designers who work in the Warhammer design studio and just work on codexes and battle tomes for Warhammer 40,000 and Age of Sigmar, they never get the experience of creating their own rules language, which was something I was lucky enough to do in Warcry. And for me, it's something I'm very proud of, because the rules language in Warcry represents how I like rules to be written. The defining element of Warcry's rules language is its simplicity. I deliberately tried to strip away as much jargon as I could to describe the rules in natural English. One of the big inspirations was the Natural English of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, the 2014 edition specifically, as the newer edition has fallen back into a more jargon-laden style. Natural English has both strengths and weaknesses, and at its worst it can lead to horribly ambiguous gameplay. Here's an example of that from 2nd edition 40k. So here we have Virus Grenade. And there are a lot more issues than just the wording with this card. It was notoriously part of the virus bomb stratagem that had to be banned because it was so powerful. Perhaps the first ever banning of something in Warhammer 40,000. But the use of natural English here and the obvious vagaries around the phrase sealed armor just make this card impossible to know what the intent of the rules writer was. So this is a bad use of natural English because of how ambiguous it is. And in this instance you would want to fix it with something like a keyword. And keywords are a great tool. Warcry uses a lot of keywords in the form of its rune marks. But keywords and jargon and other bits of rules legalese can be a double-edged sword in games design. Because when you add too many, the text becomes too hard to parse, too difficult to read. As I wrote the rules for Warcry, I kept the idea of 10-year-old Sam in my head. That's because 10 years old is how old I was when I first got into Warhammer. And so I tried to write every mechanic in a way that I thought a 10-year-old could understand. And to do this, I used simple natural English wherever possible, and kept rules jargon to a minimum. Now you do need to be careful with this sort of approach, but I think as long as natural English is applied in a consistent and unambiguous way, for me it is a superior way to writing rules over those that read like a legal document. Now I think this is quite a wide topic and it might be interesting to do a design theory video on this like I did my design theory on activation systems. So if you would like to hear me speak more on natural English versus jargon-laden rules in games design, let me know down in the comments below. While this approach to rules language and the way it's written might not seem very important at first, I think it was one of Warcry's biggest successes. And that's because I have heard many times from many people that Warcry was the game that they used to teach their non-wargaming spouse or their children how to play wargames. And for me that's a really, really big success for the game. I said in the intro to this video that when Warcry was first released, I was actually quite unhappy with its design. So in this next section of the video, I want to talk about why that was. It wasn't to do with anything previously mentioned. So the stuff that came from Jervis's prototype, as well as the parkour feel and the natural English, I thought those were all neat mechanics and good additions to the game. But I said at the start of this video that I grew up playing games like Necromunda and Mordheim. And for me, when Warcry was first released, it very much lived in the shadow of those games. I found myself judging the game for the things it missed that were present in those older games. Things like the really rich progression systems found in the campaign, or the crunchy list building with all the different equipment, war gear and weapons that you could give to your fighters. At the game's launch, there were a lot of people that were pining, wishing that Warcry was closer to those games of yore, and I was one of them. I wish I could have written a game to continue on the legacy of those games. But when you're designing a game professionally, especially working at a company, it's important to remember that you are not designing games solely for yourself. Of course, it's important to be passionate about the game and the mechanics that you're working on, but you're also trying to deliver on a very specific brief. And you're trying to match the vision that not just you have for the game, but that lots of people have for the game as well. And so while I was happy with a lot of my design work on the game, and I think that I matched the brief that was given to me, for me it didn't live up to the greats Necromunda and Mordheim, and that sort of ate away at me at launch. Now as time went on, I started to see the game in a different light. I think the elegance and simplicity of the game's design started to win over a lot of people, and I started to hear about that more and more. Inside the company, it became the favourite game of the miniature designers. They ran massive campaigns of it, which was really, really cool to see. I know on YouTube, Peachy is a big fan of Warcry. Quick shout out to Peachy. And also Uncle Atom from Tabletop Minions is a big fan of Warcry too. And as mentioned before, I had so many people come up to me at things like Warhammer Fest or open days that we ran to tell them that they played Warcry with friends that don't usually play war games, or their spouse or their kids, and it's their first experience getting into wargaming. And that is something that I'm so proud of to hear. So as time went on, I started to see the game for its own merits, seeing what it did well, what it even did better than other games, and I stopped judging it on what it wasn't. Alright, I want to quickly finish by talking about the second edition of Warcry. So when it came time to design the second edition of the game, I was still the lead designer, but this time only for the core book and the starter set, so everything that came in that box. So the 2 warbands, the book Rot and Ruin, the core book. From the compendium onwards, it was handed over to another team that took over the writing duties, and they've been carrying that baton ever since, doing a stellar job. For the second edition of the game, I didn't want to change the core rules much, so I did the lightest touch possible, which was adding in the reaction system. What I really wanted to address in the game was its campaign system. So I built a new campaign system for it from the ground up to live up to the heights of Necromunda and Mordheim. For those of you who don't know, Warcry First Edition's campaign system was very, very bare bones. You simply played 10 linked battles, and 3 of those battles were special battles called convergences. Which, by the way, is a nod to Stephen Erickson and the Malazan Book of the Fallen with all of its convergences. Power draws power. On the other hand, Warcry 2nd Edition's campaign system is one full of territory tables, exploration roles, and newer innovations such as the campaign arcs, which I spoke on briefly in my video on Inquisitor. Warcry 2nd Edition moved the action from the 8 points to this massive forest in Gur called the Gnarlwood, and during the campaign you are able to set up your encampment for your warband in various locations around it. Now every warband starts the campaign outside the Gnarlwood on its outskirts, but once the campaign is underway, in the aftermath of each battle you make exploration rolls to start exploring it. Sometimes your warriors return with treasure or items, sometimes a mishap befalls them, and sometimes they find a territory for you to move your encampment to with a whole host of bonuses. At the same time, you can embark on quests, where you complete them by doing certain things in battle and are rewarded with a magic item. There's also the campaign arcs I talked about in my Inquisitor video. A campaign arc is like a story within a story, a mini campaign within the wider campaign, and there's loads to choose from. They usually take the course of a series of linked battles with an overarching narrative, so it's a great way for players to build up rivalries between each other. I put all the bells and whistles onto that campaign system for 2nd Edition Warcry, so if it was something that you got a chance to play, I really hope you enjoyed it. Alright, that brings us to the end of today's video, and if you're a fan of Warcry, I hope you found that an interesting look into the development of the game. Rather than focusing on one particular mechanic like I did with the feedback loops in Spearhead, I wanted to instead explore what it's like to work on a game in a wider studio, like the Warhammer Design Studio at Games Workshop. Now we did touch on a few areas of games design, such as natural English versus jargon in rules writing. If that's something you would like to see expanded into a longer video on the topic, let me know in the comments below. Also, I should quickly say a lot of fans of Warcry ask me about the future of the game. I see it in comments on some of my other videos. I no longer work at Games Workshop, so I don't know what the future of the game is. But I will quickly add here that I'm working on my own fantasy skirmish game at the moment. It's a long way into its development already, and I hope to share a draft of the rules with you all soon. In some ways, you could say it will be the spiritual successor to Warcry, but it's also going to be a lot closer to Mordheim in many respects as well, both its gameplay and its theme. In fact, if you were to plot out a spectrum between the two, I'm aiming for right here, the perfect midpoint between the two, a blend of each, but also with a big spoonful of unique and new mechanics. Stay tuned for more info on that. In terms of lessons for games designers to draw from this video, I think the most important one is not to beat yourself up too much over the perceived failings of your own designs, which is something I think every designer does to a certain extent. What you might find, like I did with Warcry, is that your perceived flaws won't be something that the players dwell on much. They will start to see the game for its own merits, and the game will become celebrated for what it does well. Please remember to like this video and subscribe if you're not already. At the time of recording, we're so close to 5,000 subscribers, which is amazing. Thank you all so much for your support so far. For the next video, I had said I was going to do one that focused on a design that I wasn't proud of, but I think I might save that video for a little bit further down the line. Instead, I think it would be fun for us to go through the design process together in a video. So I'm planning to do a video on how to design a narrative campaign for 2 players, and it will be a set of simple rules that you can follow to build your own narrative campaigns to play through with your gaming friends. So that should be a lot of fun. Look forward to that video. Here's a little fun thing. In my Inquisitor video, I briefly mentioned I'm about to run a campaign of Mythic Bastion lands. Well, that campaign is now underway. Here's the custom map I drew for it. I absolutely love the design of this game, and I'm very tempted to make a video about it, perhaps with how I'm going to go about running the campaign and what mechanics in here really speak to me as a games designer. So if you would like to see a video on that, please let me know in the comments so I can gauge interest. If there's anything else you'd like to see from the channel, let me know down in the comments below. Otherwise, until next time, bye for now.